The moving truck pulled away from the house that Harold Whitman had built with his own hands 43 years ago, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks in the gravel driveway and an old man standing alone on the porch he'd constructed board by board. At 70 years old, Harold watched his son Michael load the last box into his car, his daughter-in-law Sarah avoiding eye contact, and his teenage grandson Jake staring at his phone as if the screen held more importance than a goodbye that would echo through eternity. "You're too old to maintain this place, Dad," Michael had said that morning, his voice carrying the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "We found you a nice facility. Clean, safe. They'll take care of everything." But as Harold stood there, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail he'd sanded smooth decades ago, he realized they weren't talking about taking care of him. They were talking about taking care of a problem. Hello, friends. Thank you for being here with us today. Before we dive into Harold's story, I want you to know that what you're about to hear is more than just a tale of abandonment. It's a testament to the unbreakable spirit that lives within every human heart, no matter how many birthdays we've celebrated. If Harold's journey moves you the way it moved me, consider subscribing to join our family of storytellers who believe that the most powerful chapters of our lives are often written in the margins others overlook. The silence that filled the house after they left was different from any quiet Harold had ever known. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning or the comfortable hush of evening settling in. This was the silence of abandonment, thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't name. Harold walked through the rooms he'd painted, rewired, and renovated countless times over the decades. In the kitchen, his fingers traced the countertop where he'd taught Jake to make pancakes just 3 summers ago. The boy had been so eager then, flour dusting his dark hair, syrup-sticky fingers reaching for another chance to flip the batter. Where had that boy gone? When had Jake stopped looking at him with wonder and started looking through him as if he were already a ghost? The bedroom he'd shared with Martha for 38 years, until cancer took her 5 years ago, still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume. He'd kept her side of the bed exactly as she'd left it, her reading glasses folded on the nightstand next to a bookmark marking page 247 of a romance novel she'd never finish. Martha had always believed in second chances, in new beginnings blooming from the ashes of what was lost. "What would you do, Marth?" Harold whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking like old leather. "They think I'm just done." The nice facility turned out to be Sunset Manor, a sterile building that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. Harold's room was 8 by 10 feet, smaller than the tool shed he'd built behind his house. The walls were beige, the kind of non-color that suggested the people who lived here had already faded to the point where vibrant hues would be wasted on them. His roommate, Clarence, was a hollow-eyed man who spent his days staring at a television that played game shows on endless repeat. "Been here 4 years?" Clarence mumbled when Harold introduced himself. "Family visits Christmas." Sometimes, the routine was suffocating. Breakfast at 7 sharp, runny eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard. Medication distributed like clockwork. Activities that felt more like time killers than life givers. Bingo on Tuesdays, arts and crafts that produced ashtrays nobody would ever use, and exercise classes where elderly bodies moved through motions that mocked the strength they'd once possessed. But it was the look in the staff's eyes that hurt most. Not cruel, just empty. They saw him as a task to be completed, a body to be fed and medicated, and moved from point A to point B. They didn't see Harold Whitman, master carpenter, devoted husband, father who'd worked double shifts to put his son through college. 3 weeks into his stay, Harold called Michael. "I want to come home," he said simply. The pause stretched so long, Harold wondered if the connection had been lost. "Dad, we've been through this. The house is too much for you. You had that fall last winter. I slipped on ice. Once. And what if it happens again? What if something serious happens and nobody finds you for days?" Michael's voice carried that tone Harold recognized, the same one he'd used as a teenager when he was losing an argument but refused to admit it. "This is what's best." "Best for who?" Another pause. "I have to go, Dad. Sarah's calling." The line went dead, and Harold stared at the phone in his hand, as if it might hold answers he couldn't find anywhere else. It was during his 4th week at Sunset Manor that Harold met Dolores Martinez in the recreation room. She was 91 years old, sharp as a tack, and wielding a crochet needle with the precision of a surgeon. "You look like a man who knows how to use his hands," she said without looking up from the blanket she was creating. Squares of blue and yellow that seemed to capture sunlight in their stitches. Harold glanced at his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of construction work. Used to nothing. Look around this place. You see all these people shuffling around like they're already dead? Half of them gave up because nobody told them they still had something to offer. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes bright with an intelligence that age hadn't dimmed. "What did you do before you came here to die?" "I built things." "Then why'd you stop?" The question hit Harold like a physical blow. Why had he stopped? Because Michael said he was too old? Because Sarah looked at him like he was a liability? Because society had decided that 70 meant finished? That night, Harold lay in his narrow bed listening to Clarence snore and thinking about Dolores's words. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Patterson crying again. She did that most nights, soft sobs that spoke of a loneliness so profound it had its own gravitational pull. 2 doors down, Mr. Hendricks was arguing with nurses again, his voice raised in frustrated protest about medications he didn't want to take. These people weren't just waiting to die. They were drowning in purposelessness, in the devastating realization that the world had moved on without them. Harold sat up in bed, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in months. Possibility. The next morning, Harold cornered Janet, the head nurse, during her rounds. "I want to see the maintenance requests," he said. Janet looked at him as if he'd asked to see the moon. "I'm sorry?" "The things that need fixing around here. The broken cabinets, squeaky doors, loose handrails. I know you have a list." "Mr. Whitman, residents aren't supposed to—" "I'm not asking to do brain surgery. I'm asking to fix a door hinge." Janet studied his face, perhaps seeing something she hadn't noticed before. After a moment, she pulled a clipboard from her cart. The list was 2 pages long. Harold spent the next 3 hours walking through Sunset Manor with different eyes. The dining room had wobbly tables that made eating a balance act. The recreation room's air conditioning unit rattled like it was breathing its last breath. In the garden, a beautiful gazebo sat unused because half the floorboards were rotted through. But it was in the common area that Harold found his revelation. A group of residents sat in wheelchairs and recliners, staring at nothing, their faces wearing the blank expression of people who had given up hoping for anything interesting to happen. "What if?" Harold whispered to himself, remembering the words Martha used to say when she'd get that look in her eye that meant she was about to rearrange their entire living room. What if we could build something here? Harold's hands shook as he sketched his idea on the back of a napkin during dinner. Not from age, from excitement that coursed through his veins like electricity through copper wire. He wasn't just thinking about fixing Sunset Manor's broken pieces anymore. He was thinking bigger. What if there was a place designed specifically for people who weren't ready to give up? What if someone built a community where being older meant being valued for your wisdom, not shuffled aside because of your birth date? The sketch was rough, but Harold could see it clearly. A series of small connected buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Each resident would have their own space, their own dignity, but they'd be part of something larger. Gardens where people could grow vegetables and flowers. Workshop spaces where those who wanted to could create, repair, build. A library with comfortable chairs and good light. A kitchen where residents could cook meals that reminded them of home instead of eating institutional food that tasted like cardboard compromise. Most importantly, it would be a place where people came to live, not to wait for death. That night, Harold called Michael again. "I need my tools," he said. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "My tools, in the garage. I need them. You're in a care facility. You don't need—" "I need my tools, Michael." Something in Harold's voice must have penetrated his son's defenses, because Michael's tone softened slightly. "Dad, are you okay?" Harold looked around his beige room, at Clarence snoring in the next bed, at the institutional clock on the wall that marked time without measuring life. "I'm going to be." Harold's discharge from Sunset Manor caused a minor bureaucratic earthquake. Michael arrived within hours, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You can't just leave, Dad. We have a contract with this place. We paid—" "Then I'll pay you back." "With what money?" Your Social Security barely covers. Harold pulled out a manila envelope he'd been carrying. Inside were bank statements, investment documents, insurance papers, the financial DNA of a man who'd worked every day for 53 years and lived modestly for 70. I never told you how much your mother and I saved, Harold said quietly. We wanted to leave you something, but we also wanted to live simply. We paid off the house when you were in high school. We invested. We were careful. Michael's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. The numbers weren't enormous by millionaire standards, but they represented something more powerful than wealth. They represented possibility. Dad, this is your retirement money, your security. What good is security if you're not living? Harold found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom with good bones and potential. The first night there, sleeping on an air mattress because he hadn't bought furniture yet, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The next morning, he drove to the city planning office. Getting permits for his vision turned out to be like solving a puzzle where half the pieces kept changing shape. Harold sat through zoning meetings, navigated regulations that seemed designed to discourage rather than enable, and faced skepticism from officials who couldn't understand why a 70-year-old man wanted to build a care facility from scratch. You have experience in elder care administration? Asked Mrs. Rodriguez, the zoning commissioner. I have experience being elderly, Harold replied. The months of paperwork and meetings tested Harold's patience in ways that 40 years of construction work never had. But during the waiting periods, he refined his plans. He visited other senior communities, taking notes on what worked and what didn't. He researched innovative approaches to aging, discovering programs in other countries where elderly people lived in intergenerational communities, where their wisdom was valued and their contributions encouraged. Most importantly, he started building a team. Dolores Martinez was the first person Harold called. I'm too old to move, she said when he explained his vision. Perfect. So am I. We'll be too old together. She was quiet for a long moment. This place you're describing, it sounds too good to be true. Then help me make it true. Dolores brought her friend Eugene, a retired electrician who'd been slowly dying of boredom since his wife passed. Eugene brought his neighbor Connie, a former teacher who'd raised 5 children, and knew how to organize anything from school fundraisers to small governments. Word spread in the mysterious way that hope always does, quietly, but with unstoppable determination. Harold's team grew to include Rose, a master gardener whose arthritic hands still knew their way around soil. Frank, a former bank manager who understood numbers the way musicians understand melodies. And Maria, a retired nurse who'd spent 40 years caring for others and wasn't ready to stop. They met in Harold's small apartment every Thursday night, spreading blueprints across his kitchen table and dreaming in practical terms. What would the buildings look like? How would they handle medical emergencies? What would daily life feel like for residents? It has to feel like home, Rose said one evening, her dirt-stained fingers tracing the garden plans. Not like an institution where they warehouse people until they expire. Home with support, Maria added. Independence with safety nets. 6 months into the planning process, Harold hit his first major wall. The land he wanted, a beautiful 10-acre plot with mature trees and a small stream running through it, was owned by Consolidated Development Corporation. They had plans to build a shopping center. Harold's meeting with CDC's president, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Thompson, who couldn't have been older than 35, lasted exactly 12 minutes. Mr. Whitman, I appreciate your project, but this land is zoned for commercial development. We're looking at a significant return on investment here. What about return on humanity? Thompson's smile was polite and dismissive. I'm sure there are other properties that would suit your needs. Harold left the meeting feeling like he'd been patted on the head and sent away to play with toys that didn't matter. That night, he sat in his apartment staring at the blueprints he'd drawn and redrawn dozens of times, wondering if Michael had been right. Maybe he was too old for this. Maybe dreams this big were for younger people with more time, more energy, more influence. But then his phone rang. Harold! It was Dolores. I've been thinking about what you said about that developer, about return on humanity. Yeah? What if we got the whole community involved? What if we showed them what we're really building here? Harold's presentation to the Millbrook Town Council took place on a rainy Tuesday night in November. The community center's fluorescent lights flickered over folding chairs, occupied by about 30 people, mostly curious neighbors and a few local reporters who'd heard about the old man's unusual project. Harold had prepared a speech, but when he stood at the small podium, looking out at faces that ranged from skeptical to bored to mildly interested, he folded up his notes and spoke from his heart instead. "My name is Harold Whitman, and 6 months ago my family put me in a care facility because they thought I was done," he began. "I don't blame them. That's what we do in this society. We get old, we get put away, and we wait to die." A murmur rippled through the small audience. "But I met people in that place who weren't done, who had skills, wisdom, stories, love to give. People who were dying not from age but from purposelessness." Harold gestured to Dolores, Eugene, Connie, and the others sitting in the front row. "These people aren't done. I'm not done. And we want to build something that proves it." He talked about his vision, not just the buildings and gardens, but the life that would happen within them. Residents who could cook their own meals, tend their own gardens, contribute to the community that supported them. Intergenerational programs where elderly residents could share skills with younger people, where wisdom flowed both ways. "This isn't about building another place to store old people," Harold concluded, his voice gaining strength with each word. "This is about building a place where age means wisdom, where experience is valued, where the last chapters of our lives can be the most meaningful ones we've written." When he finished, the applause was scattered and polite. Harold's heart sank as he watched people file out, their faces already moving on to the next item on their evening's agenda. But then, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman Harold recognized from the grocery store, approached him. "My husband is in Sunset Manor," she said quietly. "He was a chef for 40 years. Now they won't even let him scramble his own eggs." By the end of the evening, Harold had 17 families interested in learning more about his community. More importantly, he had something he hadn't expected: allies with influence. Town Council member Rebecca Walsh approached Harold as he was packing up his presentation materials. "Mr. Whitman, that land you want, the CDC property, it's been tied up in environmental assessments for 2 years. The stream running through it has some protected species, and there are wetland concerns." Harold's heart sank. More obstacles. "But," Rebecca continued, "a senior living community with sustainable design and environmental conservation built into the plan. That might be exactly what the Environmental Board is looking for." She was right. Harold's vision of gardens, natural water management, and buildings designed to work with the landscape rather than against it appealed to environmental groups who had been fighting CDC's shopping center proposal. Within 6 weeks, Harold found himself at the center of an unlikely coalition. Environmental activists, families with aging parents, community leaders who saw the economic potential of Harold's project, and a growing group of seniors who wanted to be part of something revolutionary. The campaign to change the land's zoning designation took 8 months. Harold testified at hearings, met with environmental scientists, and refined his plans to address every concern raised by community groups. The night the town council voted 7-2 to approve the zoning change and approve Harold's project, he sat in his small apartment, looking at the official documents, and tried to call Martha's name before remembering she wasn't there to share the victory. But Dolores was, and Eugene, and Connie, Rose, Frank, Maria, and dozens of others who had believed in a dream that was bigger than any of them individually, but perfectly sized for all of them together. Ground broke on Millbrook Commons on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 2 years after Harold had been abandoned at Sunset Manor. At 72, he stood in a hard hat and work boots, his weathered hands steady as he operated the excavator for the ceremonial first scoop of earth. The construction took 18 months. Harold was on site every day, not just supervising but working alongside contractors half his age. His team of seniors contributed their skills wherever they could. Rose designed the landscaping, Eugene handled electrical planning, Connie managed schedules and budgets with military precision. The local newspaper ran a weekly feature called Building Dreams that documented the progress. Harold became something of a local celebrity, but more importantly, He became a symbol. Letters arrived from seniors across the country who had heard about Millbrook Commons and wanted to know how they could create something similar in their own communities. The buildings rose from the ground like promises being kept. Each residential unit was designed for aging bodies but young spirits. Wider doorways for walkers and wheelchairs, but also workshops and studios for people who weren't ready to stop creating. The central courtyard featured a fountain surrounded by raised garden beds, benches positioned to encourage conversation, and pathways wide enough for easy navigation, but curved enough to create interest and discovery. But it was the small details that revealed the heart of Harold's vision. Each front door was painted a different color, not because it was required, but because Harold remembered how institutional beige had made him feel invisible. The kitchen windows faced east to catch morning light, because Harold knew that watching the sun rise was one of the simple joys that made life worth living. Millbrook Commons opened its doors on a Sunday in March, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that drew over 200 community members. Harold, now 74, cut the ribbon with shaking hands, not from age or nerves, but from the overwhelming realization that the dream he'd sketched on a napkin 3 years earlier had become concrete and steel and hope made manifest. The first residents moved in that week. Dolores chose Unit 7 because it had the best view of the garden. Eugene picked Unit 12 because it was closest to the workshop where he planned to teach electrical repair to anyone interested in learning. Maria selected Unit 3 because it was near the community health center where she would work part-time, helping other residents navigate medical appointments and medication management. But Harold saved Unit 1 for someone special. Clarence, his former roommate from Sunset Manor, had been following the Millbrook Commons story through Harold's monthly newsletters. When Harold called to offer him the first available unit, Clarence was quiet for so long, Harold wondered if the connection had been lost. "You mean I could have my own kitchen?" Clarence finally asked. "Your own kitchen, your own garden plot if you want one, your own front door that you can paint any color you like. What's the catch?" Harold smiled. "You have to be willing to live instead of just exist." Clarence moved in on a Tuesday. By Friday, he was teaching a woodworking class in the community workshop, sharing skills he'd developed during 40 years as a furniture maker, talents that had been irrelevant at Sunset Manor, but were treasured at Millbrook Commons. Harold's phone rang on a Thursday evening in April, 6 months after Millbrook Commons opened. "Dad?" Harold's hand tightened on the receiver. "Hello, Michael. I saw the article about your place in the state newspaper." The article had been a feature story about innovative approaches to senior living, with Millbrook Commons highlighted as a model that other communities were beginning to replicate. "It's not my place," Harold said quietly. "It's our place. Dad, I owe you an apology." The words Harold had waited 3 years to hear sounded strange in the evening quiet of his small apartment. His choice to maintain his independence while being part of the Millbrook Commons community. "I thought I was protecting you," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. Harold hadn't heard since his son was a small boy. "I thought you were done. I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to worry about me," Harold replied, surprising himself with how little anger he felt. "You were wrong to decide what I was capable of without asking me. Would it be okay if I visited? If I saw what you've built?" Harold looked out his window at the courtyard of Millbrook Commons, where Dolores was teaching her great-niece to crochet while Eugene showed a group of teenagers how to wire a lamp. In the garden, Rose was working alongside 3 middle school students who came by every Tuesday as part of an intergenerational learning program. "We'd love to have you," Harold said. Michael arrived on a Saturday morning, his wife Sarah and son Jake in tow. Harold met them at the entrance to Millbrook Commons, his heart pounding with nervousness he hadn't felt since his first day on a construction site 50 years ago. Jake, now 16, looked around the courtyard with undisguised curiosity. "Grandpa, this is actually pretty cool." Pretty cool from a teenager was equivalent to miraculous from anyone else. Sarah, who had seemed so cold during Harold's departure from his old house, walked through the community with growing amazement. She stopped at the art studio where an 86-year-old former art teacher was working on a watercolor painting, while chatting with a young mother who'd brought her toddler to the weekly intergenerational art session. "This isn't what I expected," Sarah said quietly. "What did you expect?" Harold asked. "Another nursing home. just fancier. Harold understood. Most people couldn't imagine what aging could look like when it was approached with creativity and respect rather than fear and resignation. The tour lasted 3 hours. Michael asked detailed questions about the financing, the staffing model, the healthcare integration. But it was Jake who asked the question that mattered most. "Grandpa, are you happy here?" Harold looked around at the community he dreamed into existence. Dolores was laughing with Maria over coffee on her front porch. Eugene was showing a neighbor how to fix a squeaky door hinge. In the garden, residents and visitors worked side by side, their conversations flowing across generational lines as naturally as water finding its level. "Jake," Harold said, "I'm not just happy, I'm alive." As Harold's story spread, visitors came from across the country to see Millbrook Commons. Architects studied the design principles, social workers analyzed the community structure. Policymakers explored the financial model that made it sustainable. But for Harold, the true measure of success wasn't in the accolades or the replication projects being planned in other states. It was in the daily rhythms of life he witnessed from his kitchen window. Clarence had started a weekly poker game that drew players ranging from 28 to 93. Rose's intergenerational gardening program had expanded to include 3 local schools and a partnership with the community food bank. Maria's health advocacy workshops had reduced emergency room visits among residents by 60%, not through medical intervention but through education and community support. Most importantly, people were choosing to move to Millbrook Commons not as a last resort, but as a positive life decision. Waiting lists grew as word spread about a place where aging meant growing, not shrinking. On Harold's 76th birthday, the community organized a celebration in the courtyard. As the sun set behind the buildings he'd designed and built, Harold sat surrounded by the extended family he'd created through vision and determination. Michael and Sarah had become regular visitors, bringing Jake for weekend stays that strengthened bonds that had seemed permanently broken. But more than family reconciliation, Harold had discovered something he hadn't expected: mentorship that flowed in both directions. Young families in the area had begun requesting Harold as a consultant for construction projects, not just for his technical expertise, but for his perspective on building homes that would serve families through all of life's stages. Harold found himself in the unusual position of being busier at 76 than he'd been at 66. "You know what I learned?" Harold said to the gathered crowd as he blew out the candles on a cake Dolores had insisted on baking from scratch. "I learned that endings aren't really endings. They're just pauses before new beginnings." Jake, now 17 and preparing for college, raised his hand. "Grandpa, I want to study architecture and community planning. Because of this place. Because of what you showed me was possible." Harold's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for a life that had given him not one great purpose, but 2, building homes for families, and then building a community that redefined what family could mean. As our story ends, Harold continues to live at Millbrook Commons, but he's no longer just a resident. He's an elder in the truest sense of the word, a person whose wisdom shapes the community's growth and evolution. Letters arrive weekly from other communities working to replicate the Millbrook Commons model. Harold responds to each one personally, sharing blueprints and lessons learned, but always emphasizing that the real foundation isn't in the buildings. It's in the belief that human potential doesn't expire with age. The boy who was abandoned by his family at 70 had become a man who created new families for hundreds of others. The man who was told he was too old to matter had proven that the most important work of his life began after his 70th birthday. Harold Whitman's story reminds us that the word retirement doesn't have to mean withdrawal from purpose. It can mean graduation to significance. That being older doesn't mean being finished. It means being experienced. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept other people's limitations as our own reality. In the courtyard of Millbrook Commons, where the fountain Harold designed catches afternoon light and transforms it into dancing reflections, there's a small plaque with words he chose carefully. This community was built on the radical belief that every life has value, every person has purpose, and every ending is actually a beginning in disguise. Harold reads those words every morning as he walks to the workshop where he's teaching Jake's friend how to use a saw safely, where Clarence is finishing a rocking chair for his newest great-grandchild, where the sound of creation continues because someone decided that being 70 wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the most important chapter yet to be written.